They handed the new nurse the veteran no one could reach, and they were already laughing before she opened his door. I want to tell you something before we get into this story. I've read a lot of accounts sent to this channel. Stories from nurses, from veterans, from people who spent years being invisible in rooms full of people who should have seen them. This one stayed with me. If you're new here, welcome to Quiet Badge's Stories. Hit the like button if you believe in the quiet ones. Subscribe if you want more. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I want to know how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you about Meredith Solis. Meredith Solis had been at Eastbrook Veterans Medical Center for 23 days. 23 days of being handed the overflow, charting nobody else wanted. 23 days of being called the new girl by doctors who hadn't bothered learning her name. 23 days of keeping her head down in the break room, while the senior nurses built their social architecture around her, like she was a chair placed in the wrong hallway. She was 34 years old. She wore bright teal scrubs that were half a size too large at the shoulders. Her dark hair stayed tucked behind her ears, and she rarely spoke unless a patient needed her to. Her coworkers read her silence as anxiety. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about most things. The morning it changed started like all the others. Carol Yates, the head nurse on the medical surgical floor, found Meredith at the medication cart at 7:15. Room 9, Carol said. She tapped the name on the assignment sheet with one manicured nail. Gunnery Sergeant Aldous Kern. Army, retired. 42, blast TBI from 2 tours. Expressive aphasia. He understands everything fine, can't say much back, and what he does say comes out scrambled. Partial vision loss in the left eye. She paused. And he threw a tablet at one of our residents last Thursday. Dr. Victor Brennan appeared from the physician workroom, a tablet in one hand and a particular kind of expression on his face. The one that told you he'd already made a decision about you and wasn't interested in revising it. You can try the whiteboard. He doesn't cooperate. He said it like a dare dressed up as instructions. Dr. Tully, the second-year resident who had apparently decided Meredith was a reliable audience for his condescension, lifted his phone just enough for her to notice. Should we start a pool? Time until she comes back out? A few nurses near the printer smiled into their coffee. Carol didn't smile exactly, but she didn't stop him either. Meredith looked down at the chart. Aldous Kern, Gunnery Sergeant, Army Special Operations Aviation Command, blast injury in Kandahar Province, multiple TBIs compounding over 6 years, expressive aphasia, Broca's type, severe, comprehension intact, partial blindness, left eye, old shrapnel wound, current admission, fall during outpatient physical therapy, rib contusion, monitoring for post-concussive symptoms. The red notation appeared twice, combative, non-compliant. She had seen enough charts where neither label was accurate to know what they usually meant. Someone had stopped trying to understand him. And when understanding stopped, frustration started, and frustrated people got labeled things that followed them through every chart for the rest of their lives. She picked up a dry erase marker, the laminated pain assessment picture card from the supply shelf, and the floor whiteboard. Then she walked down the hall toward room 9. The laughter followed her. But it was already quieter than it should have been, and she noticed that too. The people who mocked you before you walked away were always louder than the ones who'd seen you walk back. Room 9 smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, same as everything else at Eastbrook. What was different was Aldous Kern. He sat in the chair beside the bed, not the bed itself, back against the wall. One boot flat on the floor, the other foot tucked under his thigh. His one good eye moved to the door the second Meredith's hand touched the frame. His left eye was half closed, the iris clouded and faded. There but not whole, the way certain things survive damage without fully recovering from it. A scar ran from his left temple to the edge of his jaw. Old enough to be part of his face rather than something that had happened to it. He was broad through the chest and clearly hadn't let the TBI interrupt his PT. His hands rested on his knees, not loosely, precisely. 2 nurses' aides from the previous shift had left a tablet in the corner with a cracked screen and no stylus. The whiteboard on the wall read, "Patient has aphasia, use table T, the tablet was dead." Meredith pulled the chair from beside the window, the one not near the exit, and placed it 4 feet from him. Then she sat down. She did not speak. Kern watched her. She held up the whiteboard and the marker. Then she pointed to herself and wrote, "Meredith, your nurse today." She angled it so his good eye could read without strain. He stared at it, then he reached out. She handed him the marker without hesitation. He wrote in capitals, slow and deliberate, "Where is the other one?" She wrote, "Not here, you're with me now." He considered that. "Then you sign?" She wrote, "No, but I can listen." He gave a short exhale through his nose, the kind of breath that said he'd heard that particular sentence before and knew the odds. Then he wrote, "Pain, head, bad, since last night." She held up the laminated pain scale and pointed to each face on the scale. He tapped the second from the top, 8 out of 10. She wrote, pressure sharp behind the eyes. He tapped his left temple and drew a slow circle outward with one finger, pressure spreading. She leaned forward, not threateningly, just close enough to see his eyes clearly. She raised 2 fingers and pointed to his pupils in sequence, asking permission. He gave her a single nod. She checked. His right pupil was round and reactive, tracking her penlight the way it should. His left was marginally larger than it should have been. 0.5 millimeter, maybe. Nothing a rushed assessment would catch. Everything a careful one would. She wrote, how long has the headache been getting worse? He wrote, 3 days. She felt the temperature of the room change inside her chest. Not panic. Something colder and more useful than panic. She wrote, was it reported? He wrote, I tried. She stood. She kept her movements easy, no urgency in them that might alarm him. She moved to the vitals machine. Blood pressure, 174/98, heart rate 58. She counted his respirations herself, 14. She checked grip strength. His right hand was firm, his left noticeably less so, and when she asked him to extend both arms in front of him, his left drifted slightly downward. This was not anxiety. This was not psychosomatic. This was a man whose brain was being pressed from the inside, and who had been trying for 3 days to tell someone. She held up one finger before she left the room. One finger, then she pointed to the floor. Stay. He read it, nodded once. At the nurse's station, she picked up the phone. I need Dr. Brennan in room 9. Kern left arm drift on extension, BP 174/98 and trending up. He needs a stat head CT. Carol looked up from her screen. He has a documented history of somatic complaints, Meredith. Pupils aren't somatic. Brennan arrived in 3 minutes, which was fast enough to mean he'd been nearby, waiting for her to need rescuing. He glanced at the chart, then at her, with the specific impatience of a man who had decided confidence looked like certainty. He's been flagging headache since admission. Post-concussive, anxious about imaging, documented somatization history. He made a note without looking up. Document it. Anxiety protocol. His left pupil is 2 millimeters larger than his right. Marginally. Marginally is the beginning of herniation. Brennan's expression went flat. Nurse Solis, you have been here 3 weeks. The pupil doesn't know that. The silence that followed had weight to it. Carol and 2 other nurses had gone very still. Brennan turned away. Document the anxiety protocol. Reassess this afternoon. He left. Tully lingered for a moment, phone in hand, then followed. Carol went back to her computer without looking at Meredith. Meredith stood at the nurse's station for 4 seconds. Then she went back to room 9. Kern had not moved. She sat across from him and wrote on the whiteboard. I flagged it, they said wait, I'm not waiting. He read it. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, not just tracking her as a presence in the room, and raised his right hand. He made a single quick gesture, 2 fingers extended, sweeping left. She knew what it meant before she'd finished processing that she knew it. SOCOM, hold position, I see you. Her hands went still on the whiteboard. She answered without thinking. One fist, wrist rotated, acknowledged. Kern stopped breathing for a half second. His good eye moved to her left wrist, where her sleeve had shifted when she answered. She wore a plain watch there, not decorative, analog, with a second hand because she still timed certain things manually. Below the watch face, barely visible, was a small burn scar. Rope and heat, old and healed clean. The kind you got when you went into a structure you weren't cleared to enter, and didn't have the right gear, because the right gear was still outside. He picked up the marker. He wrote one word. Hauk. She didn't answer immediately. He wrote again, you were List Kia. She looked at that for a moment, then she wrote, Hawk is retired, I'm just a nurse. He stared at that sentence for a long time. Then he picked up the marker one more time and wrote 4 words, slowly, like he was making sure each one landed. You never were just anything. She saved the feeling that produced for somewhere, it wouldn't interfere with what needed to happen. Then she pressed the rapid response button. The announcement cut through the floor, rapid response, room 9. Rapid response, room 9. Brennan made it there fast. Fast enough that she knew he'd been close, which meant he'd been waiting for this. For the chance to be right about her. He took in the response team and turned on her. What did you do? His GCS dropped a point in the last 8 minutes. He vomited once. The left arm drift is more pronounced. Dr. Irene Weston from neurology arrived with the team, badge swinging. She was small and fast, with the quality of absolute attention that separated good neurologists from the rest of the field. She went straight to Kern without acknowledging Brennan, checked his pupils, moved a penlight slowly across his visual field. Her face changed. Left pupil non-reactive, she said, in the tone of someone already 3 moves ahead. She turned to Brennan. How long has this been documented? Brennan said. The nurse has been escalating a patient she met 2 hours ago without. How long, Arthur? A beat of silence. She noted it approximately 50 minutes ago. Weston ordered the CT before she finished saying it. She called neurosurgery while the portable machine rolled through the door. She did not explain herself to Brennan and did not appear to consider whether she should. The image came up on the portable screen. Kern's right temporal region showed a lens-shaped hyperdentity sitting between skull and brain, roughly the size of a walnut. Epidural hematoma. Blood accumulating under pressure, slow and certain, and not remotely related to anxiety. Weston said, quiet enough that only the people closest to her heard it. If he'd been sedated at any point in the last hour, we would not be having this conversation. Nobody spoke. Tully's phone disappeared into his pocket. Carol stood at the doorway with her hands locked together. Brennan stared at the image on the screen with the expression of a man who had just watched the ground he was standing on become something else. Meredith was already at the bedside, one hand resting near the rail where Kern could see it clearly. She gave the signal again without thinking, still here. He reached up and tapped her wrist once, not a grip, just a touch. The way someone acknowledges a presence when the right words for it don't exist in any language they currently have access to. I know, she said. Kern went to the OR within 40 minutes. While they prepped him, Meredith sat at the nurse's station and documented everything. Every vital sign and every timestamp. Every time she had raised the concern and every response she had received. The facts, clean and consecutive, because a documented record was the one thing that couldn't be quietly revised. At 11:40, Carol found her in the supply room restocking the crash cart. Administration wants you. Is he stable? He's in surgery, Weston scrubbed in herself, a pause, he's going to be all right. Meredith set down the supplies, then I'll go. Carol stopped her in the doorway, not blocking, just present. I laughed this morning, she said, when Tully made the pool comment. I know. I told myself it was harmless. Meredith looked at her evenly. The things we watch and don't stop are never harmless to the person they're aimed at. They just look small from where you're standing. Carol flinched, she probably deserved to. The administrative conference room on the 3rd floor had framed mission statements on every wall. Meredith had noticed in 23 days that the places with the most framed values were often the ones still figuring out how to live them. Director Hollis sat at the head of the table. Brennan was to his right, arms crossed. Tully sat beside him, looking like he'd rather be somewhere without fluorescent lighting. Carol took the chair nearest the door. Nurse Solis, Hollis said, sit please. I'm fine standing. Brennan leaned forward. You bypassed physician authority to escalate a patient you had known for under 2 hours. I bypassed a refusal to act on documented clinical deterioration. You made that call unilaterally. The pupil made it, I reported. Hollis tapped his pen on the table. Rapid response activation without physician order is grounds for formal review. I understand, his GCS was dropping. Brennan's voice sharpened. A nursing assessment is not a neurological diagnosis. A pen light and 2 fingers isn't a diagnosis. It's an observation. I observed and I reported. What happened after that is a question for this table, not me. Something moved through the room, not quite silence. The sound of people recalculating. Hollis said, there is also the matter of what Sergeant Kern called you. He set down his pen. Hawk, that's a military designation. Meredith said nothing. Brennan opened a folder. He'd been busy. A combat medic with that call sign was attached to an Army Special Operations element. Listed killed in action during a classified engagement. Operation Iron Veil, 6 years ago. He looked up with the expression of someone who thought he'd found a weapon. I'd like you to explain that. Meredith looked at him without hurrying. I'd like you to explain why Sergeant Kern had a worsening headache in his chart for 3 days, and nobody looked at his pupils. The door opened. Dr. Weston walked in directly from the OR, still in her scrub cap, badge swinging. She set a surgical summary on the table and sat without waiting to be invited. Clinically significant epidural hematoma, right temporal, with mass effect. Evacuation successful, he will recover. She looked at Brennan without warmth. If he had been sedated at any point in the window Solis was raising concerns, he would have herniated before we reached imaging. I will state that in any forum this hospital chooses. Hollis read through the report. Brennan stared at the wall. The door opened again. A man in a dark jacket stood in the frame with 2 others behind him. Federal identification, the kind with actual weight behind it. Director Hollis, the man said. Agent Reeves, Duty Inspector General. We've been building a case related to Operation Iron Veil for some time, and this morning's events have accelerated our timeline considerably. We have confirmation that Sergeant Kern brought physical documentation to this facility and that someone with inside access alerted a private contractor to his admission date and medical status. He looked at Brennan. Your name appears in 3 communication logs. Brennan went still. Tully's voice came out thin. He said it was a records compliance check. He said Kern had taken classified property. I gave him the ward access Ella's log. I didn't know what he was going to do with it. His voice cracked. I didn't know. Carol closed her eyes. Meredith moved toward the door. Hollis said, Where are you going? Kern is going to come out of anesthesia in a recovery room he doesn't recognize. His nurse should be there. No one stopped her. He came back slowly, the way people return from that particular depth, blinking, one hand reaching before his eyes were fully focused. Meredith was in the chair beside him, positioned where his good eye would find her first. She held up the whiteboard. Surgery went well. You're in recovery. I'm here. Kern read it. His right hand moved, unsteady from the anesthesia but deliberate, the SOCOM signal, still here. She answered, acknowledged. His mouth worked. Aphasia didn't vanish with a hematoma evacuation, but pressure off the brain sometimes brought things back. Small things, words that had been sitting just below reachable. What came out was rough and slow and cost him something to produce. Hawk. Kern, she said. He exhaled like a man who had been holding something for a long time. He reached for the whiteboard and she gave him the marker. His writing was shakier than before but legible. He wrote, They know you're alive now. She wrote, They knew before today. He wrote, Worth it. She looked at the question. Then she wrote, You were breathing when I left that ore, you tell me. The damaged eye creased at the corner, not quite a smile, a door that had been closed for a while, opening. He wrote 3 words, and she read them twice. The first time felt like looking at something she hadn't been ready for. The board read. She came back. 6 weeks later, Eastbrook Veterans Medical Center looked the same from outside. The flags flew. The cafeteria muffins were still dry, and the veterans still complained about them, which Meredith had come to understand was actually a good sign. People who feel safe enough to complain about small things are people who feel safe. Inside, things had changed. Brennan resigned before the federal charges were formally filed. It didn't help him much. Tully entered remediation and sent Meredith a handwritten note, 3 sentences. The last one, I knew something was wrong and I chose not to know. That kind of honesty was rarer than it should be. She kept the note. Not for comfort, because it deserved to be witnessed. Director Hollis issued a formal written apology. Meredith wrote back 1 sentence, Don't apologize, fix it. He did, to his credit. A new policy required documented communication attempts, specific time-stamped, method noted, before any veteran could be designated non-compliant on a chart. Aphasia patients received qualified communication support on every shift. No tablet propped in a corner with a dead battery. A person with training with time. No student or resident entered a veteran's room for observation purposes without written patient consent. Carol stayed. That surprised Meredith most. She'd expected excuses or a quiet transfer request. Instead, Carol showed up early, stayed late, and spent her lunch breaks twice a week in the speech-language therapy workshop the hospital quietly made mandatory for charge nurses. One afternoon, Meredith passed a doorway and saw Carol sitting beside a Vietnam-era veteran with expressive aphasia, a communication board between them, working through a pain assessment with the patience of someone who had decided patience was the job. Carol looked up. Meredith gave her one nod. Not forgiveness, recognition of work that had begun. Kern was discharged on a Tuesday. His daughter drove in from Albuquerque and stood in the hall with the fond exasperation of someone who had spent a lifetime being proud of a man who made it difficult. He walked out under his own power, which his surgeon described as remarkable, and Meredith described as exactly what she had expected. At the nurse's station, the same station where the morning had started with a pool on how fast she'd fail, Kern stopped beside his wheelchair even though he no longer needed it. He held up the whiteboard he'd carried from his room, because he'd said it was faster than waiting for words, and Meredith privately thought he was right. He'd written it the night before. His handwriting was steadier now. Speech therapy was going well. The board read, You decided I wasn't worth the trouble. You decided she was easy to dismiss. You were wrong about both of us, and you'll be a better ward for it. Meredith read it aloud for the hall, because he had asked her to, and because some things need a voice even when their author can't provide one in the way they used to. No one moved for a long moment. Kern stood up from the wheelchair, against the transport aide's gentle protest, and walked to where Meredith stood at the counter. He raised his right hand. One fist, wrist rotated. She answered the same. Then he walked out with his daughter into an October morning that was exactly as ordinary as every other Tuesday, except for all the ways it wasn't. Meredith watched them go. She clipped her badge straight on her scrub pocket. It read Solis RN. No rank, no call sign, no classified footnote. That was enough. There's something I've noticed from the stories that come into this channel. The ones that stay with you aren't always about the dramatic reveals or the last-minute interventions. They're about the moment before any of that. The moment when someone decided to pull up a chair and wait to be heard, and someone else decided to stay in the room long enough to hear them. The world has never run short on loud people. It probably never will. What it runs short on is the quiet ones who already know what they're doing and show up anyway. In rooms that haven't earned them yet, in places that handed them the hardest case as a joke and didn't expect them to walk back out with answers. If you're one of those people, I see you. And if you haven't found them yet in your life, be patient. They're there. They're just waiting for the room to get quiet enough. From wherever you're listening tonight, thank you for being here. This has been Quiet Badges Stories.